The first week we talked about sacraments in general and about communion. And then last week we talked about baptism and confirmation. And realizing in the Presbyterian Church we only have the two, baptism and communion. We do all the other practices, but we don't refer to those as sacraments. Whereas in the Catholic Church they refer to all seven as being sacraments. And it occurred to me today, I was mentioning to someone, that with these other five, we tend to think of them in terms of ourselves. It's my wedding day. It's my child's baptism. It's my father's funeral. Rather than it's my confessional or my ordination. Rather than communion and baptism that are of the congregation. But actually these are celebrations of the congregation. And whenever we want to celebrate wedding, any of the seven, we need to go into the session to get the permission. And afterwards, Maria and I report that we did this. And if it's a baptism or a communion, we cannot do so by ourselves. We need to have at least an elder go along with us, if not the full session, to participate in it. The difficulty was, and I suffered with this in another church, they had a minister in the 1950s who, as the neighborhood was being built, would go from house to house, calling on people, welcoming them to the neighborhood, and saying, do you have a new child in the house? We'll baptize them. And take them right into the kitchen sink and have the baptism. There was no record that this had ever taken place. So churches get to be a little testy about our records. A lot of what we're dealing with. Remember we said the first week that the sacraments are about a spiritual activity, a feeling, an experience that you want to pass on. The physical manifestation of the grace being given, of being passed into salvation from the relationship you were. It changes your identity. All of this is familiar so far? Okay. Tonight I want to deal with ordination and with marriage. And thought we'll start with ordination because it's easier before we get into marriage. And in the Presbyterian Church, it's a confusing issue to other denominations because we are the only denomination that elects, ordains, and installs our leaders for all of us. We don't have a separate group that the ministers come from, such as the Jesuits for the priesthood. We don't have ministers coming from outside. They have to be a member of the congregation before they can do this. In many congregations, you are elected to leadership, but you're not ordained. And in most other congregations, they don't understand how laity can be ordained. What's laity?
Non-minister.
Non-ministers. So all of you folks, are you baptized? In the Bible and in the Book of Order, it describes that those who are baptized can preach, you can pray, you can lay hands on others, you can be present with each other. You cannot be the full church celebrating communion or baptism because those are reserved for the ministers according to our Book of Order. But as members of the church, you are following Jesus' example of having been anointed, been claimed by God as a child of God, so you can pray and you can preach. And one of the things Mario wants to guide the church in is on the second Tuesday of each month, having an evening prayer service that would start off with teaching people to pray for about 15 minutes and then praying together for half an hour each week. And over the course of a year, learning more about praying together and different ways to pray. So an exciting possibility. Other denominations don't understand how we can have people who are ordained, who are members of the congregation. Ordained historically goes back to the Middle Ages. And just as you had royalty, who were a bloodline, you also had the clergy, who were a separate caste in the system. And you had shopkeepers, and you had weavers, and all the different artisans. You had clergy, who were a separate class unto ourselves. And going back to the Old Testament, you had the book of Leviticus, where the Levites were a group of priests who didn't hold property. They had the ability to be part of every other tribe, but did not hold property because they were to be provided for by everyone else. These were the priests in the culture. The difficulty for clergy is that we are members of the congregation as we grow up, and there comes a point in time when you accept a call that you go through a process of change to become ordained. The same is true for our deacons and elders. In the Presbyterian Church, we used to have a fourth class, but they were not ordained. Remember what that one was? We have ministers, elders, deacons.
Trustees?
We had trustees. But the difficulty always is the session make the decisions for the church. They are the governing body, and after they had made their decisions, they always had to go to the trustees to ask permission to spend the money. And the trustees would often say no, which then meant that they really weren't the decision-making body. So now all of our elders who are on session, who are installed, are automatically trustees of the church, provided they're over 18 years of age. In New York State, 21, because you have to be able to hold property. And being a trustee means you can buy and sell property. It also means you can be sued. So if ever the church is in a lawsuit, if ever the church gets into buying and selling real estate, those who are youth elders cannot participate in the discussion. They can sit in and listen, but they can't participate. So the process by which you become, questions?
So we don't have.
You don't have trustees then?
The elders are trustees. So all of our elders are our trustees, automatically. But there's not a separate meeting for them, no. And in that way, this is one of the reasons why at the annual meeting, we don't, as a congregation, approve the budget, because the trustees already have. The session has done so.
But some Presbyterian churches still have trustees, don't they?
Some churches do,
Yeah.
yes. Particularly larger churches around the country, and those where they really liked this. Every church has its own unique flavor. This is a congregation where the deacons are automatically ushers. I'd never encountered that before. Mario described he run into that in several different places. In the South, the deacons are often the property and finance committee of the church. Where do deacons come from? It's biblical. Where do deacons come from? Stephen. In the book of Acts, the elders, the disciples, were preaching and praying and visiting and waiting tables to be able to feed the orphans and the widows and the sick, and they didn't have enough time to do everything. So parts of the congregation were being neglected, and the people complained to Peter that this was happening, and so the disciples elected 12 others who would be the deacons and laid hands upon them, ordained them, so that they would be deacons, to do whatever was necessary so the disciples could do their work. Who are the disciples? Are the ministers the disciples? Are the elders the disciples? Martin Luther described the priesthood of all believers. So all of us are actual ministers. You are baptized, you are part of the life of the church, you are ministers. But oftentimes we don't take that ministry as seriously. And the rules differ slightly for each one. The ordination is exactly the same. So that when Sandy was ordained as a deacon, when Bill recently was ordained as an elder, and male, female, we go back and forth, we ordain each, as well as my ordination as a minister, our questions were exactly the same, with the question of the last two: will you be a faithful minister, elder, deacon, and will the congregation agree to pay the minister fairly? We don't pay our elders and deacons. Consequently, because we have the same ordination for all of them, you can't make a separate rule for the elders and deacons than you have for the ministers. So elders and deacons need to be members of the congregation before they can be elected. You actually have to be a member of the church for at least a year before you can be considered for being elected as an elder or deacon. Same is true for ministers. You have to be a member of a Presbyterian church for at least a year before you can be elected to go to seminary. And one of the problems we ran into with Marilyn Shannon was that she had never actually been before the congregation to be approved to go to seminary to become a minister. She had been approved to go for Christian education, to be a certified educator, but not as a pastor. And so when it came at the end, that then became a time difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Presbyterians love our government structure. We love rules. We're very good at the rules and making sure that everybody follows them. Once you have been elected to go to seminary, there's actually 3 different responsibilities. We are elected, ordained, and installed. And you are elected. I was elected to go to seminary. Each of you were elected to be elders or deacons. I was then elected to be the pastor of this congregation. When you're elected to be a pastor or an elder or a deacon, you are ordained. And just like baptism, it's ordained for life. What's ordination? What is it? Communion, we said, was the bread and wine that's the body and blood of Christ, that's our salvation. Baptism is the welcoming into the congregation. It is redemption of sin. It's the water. It's the Holy Spirit. What is ordination?
Setting apart.
It is to become sacred, to be holy. It is also to be a servant. So one of the things a minister, elder, or deacon does is to kneel down, to bow down before the congregation, usually before the communion table, and to answer different vows. Just as you do in marriage, you take on a new identity. Just as in baptism, you take on that new identity. In ordination, you do as well. And the questions, there's a whole series of them, but in basic, it is, will you read the Bible? Will you consult it in the decisions that you make? Will you pray? Will you consider the confessions of the church and the history of the church in your decision making? Will you listen to other people and work together with those people? Will you be part of the responsibility of leadership in the church? And will the church respect your decisions? All of which makes perfect logical sense to us, but we need to ask those questions. Because occasionally people want to run things by themselves and not work with other people, not be a team player, and we want to ask that right up front. The ordination happens once in life and happens for all your life. But you can be installed and step out of that installation as many times as happens in your life. Elders and deacons, you serve for a 3-year term and then can be renewed for another 3-year term. One of the difficulties that the Presbyterian Church is having nowadays is people who can't commit to a 3-year time frame. Our lives are changing so rapidly. People are saying, I could commit to a year, and I can do this year by year, but do I have to do it for 3 years? This congregation, actually, by reading the histories of the church, one of the things I discovered was that from 1801, when the church began, until the 1930s, this church had ordained elders who were ordained and installed for life. You only had one group of elders, and once you were elected to be an elder, you were always an elder. And there was no one else elected. And the session met on Christmas Day. Only one meeting per year. It happened on Christmas Day at the pastor's house, and the pastor would read their diary to the session of what happened throughout the course of the year. I had so many baptisms, I had this funeral, I had these weddings, this was the decision I made, and the session would either say, we don't think you made the right decision there, or we want to talk about that one, or we ratify the decision that you made. And it would be an entire day of going through their diary to recite this back. In 1933, we as a church decided that process probably doesn't work very well, and we need to rotate in the leadership. So we follow the example that most of the Presbyterian churches do today, and that is that a third of the session and deacons go off every year, and a new third come on, so that every year it's rotating, so that over the course of 3 years, you have an entirely new session. And you can serve a second 3-year term, but if Judy Gelston came on and served 1 year, and then was elected to a new 3-year term, she couldn't be elected to another 3-year term. She'd have to go off for a year before she came on. If you've served a term, you've served a term. Ministers serve a term for however long it lasts, for however long it's good and healthy in the congregation. So it's a 3-way call. The denomination, which in our case is the Presbytery, the local congregation, and the pastors, and God, all together are consulted as to whether this is a good relationship. And once it's established, no one individual in that can get rid of the others. If you as a congregation decided that you wanted to be fired, you couldn't do so if the Presbytery decided that they wanted the minister to stay, and if the minister wanted to stay. If the Presbytery decided we don't like the things that are going on at that church, we want to remove the pastor, if the congregation wants the minister to stay, and the minister wants to stay, the Presbytery really can't remove them. And by that token, I've never seen it happen, but if the minister wanted to leave, and the Presbytery and Synod both said no, they really can't leave. You have to stay. I actually did know a situation in another congregation where the minister accepted a new call and left, but had not been dismissed, and so was called back and prosecuted in the first church for having left their responsibilities and not followed through, not taking the responsibility seriously. The preparation for ministry is also a 3-part piece. It's education, it's denominational process, and it's also matching with the congregation. So in order to be a minister, you have to get a bachelor's degree from some accredited university or college. Mine happens to be in urban planning. Mario's is in law, and you have to go to an accredited college and graduate with a 4-year degree, not necessarily in the ministry. Some do go for religious studies. Some go for psychology, for finance. There's a variety of different fields that tend to go into the ministry. For me, it was understanding how communities work and what the resources and needs of communities are, because I knew at 12 that this is what I eventually was going to be called into. Once you've got your college degree, you then need to be elected by the congregation and elected by the Presbytery to go to seminary. And seminary needs to be an accredited seminary, and it's a 3-year master's degree. You don't actually have to have a Master of Divinity. You could have a Master's in Religious Education, which is what the Christian educators do. And with that, you could be ordained to be a minister. The Book of Orders simply says a master's degree. But you then have to sit for the written exams and for the oral exams as well. And the education at seminary is in 3 different fields: in theology, in church history, and in the practice of ministry. So the practice of ministry gets into everything from auditing and finance to psychology to preaching, counseling, what have you. Also, most seminaries and presbyteries now require having at least a summer in clinical pastoral education, where you are a chaplain in a hospital for that time. And in that time, you're going through group therapy and individual counseling, as well as being a chaplain in the hospital, or nursing homes are now doing this as well, and hospices are doing chaplaincy as well. Mario actually served as a chaplain for a year, so he gets some very good skills in this young man. The church history, because the problems of the church are not new. The problems we're encountering today are a new context, new circumstance, but the same issues the church has dealt with throughout time. Culture changes, who should be leaders. In an earlier age, it was a question of whether Greeks and Jews could both be in the church, whether slaves and free could both be in the church. More recently, in the 1920s, it was whether men and women could both be ordained as elders and deacons. When was it that we had women ministers start?
50s.
1957. Actually happened here in Syracuse. As you're on 690 going into Syracuse, right at West and Genesee Street, there's an old neo-Gothic church there. It's the old First Presbyterian Church. That was the first church that ever ordained a woman minister of any denomination, and she was Presbyterian. She's actually a good friend of mine, Margaret Towner. She served in Wisconsin, where I was. My mother went to seminary before women were ordained in the 1940s, and she wanted to be able to be a pastor. She had the gifts and skills for it, but at that time the church did not do so. And so she served as a Christian educator. She served on many committees and worked for Presbytery, but she could not be an ordained minister because ordination comes through that denomination. And this is still the struggle that the Catholic Church is questioning today, of whether male and female can both be ordained, whether ministers can be married or not. One of the controversies that came up in the 1960s for ordination was what social issue? Divorce. If a minister gets divorced, can they continue to be a minister? Or do they give up the ordination? Do they give up the local congregation? At that point in time, if you got divorced, you were removed from the congregation. But whether you would be removed from ordination was a question. And it came back to, for elders and deacons, if you get divorced, can you still be an elder or deacon? And because they could, ministers could. It always goes back to its ordination, regardless of whether it's for elder, deacon, or minister. And for membership, who can be elected to be an elder or deacon? Any member of the church who's been a member for at least a year. So one of the issues about homosexuality was that we accepted for membership those who were gay and lesbian. This was not something they had to repent of in order to be a member. But the question came in being an elder, deacon, or minister. These were role models for us. And so one of the earlier decisions was that we would not ordain for people who were gay and lesbian. And they came back saying, but we said anyone could be who was a member of the church. And that's the question that really got raised with this whole issue. the pastors serve a variety of functions. And one of the things I've learned from other denominations has been very helpful in this. We serve the role of being a pastor and a priest and a presbyter. If you are the priest, what can you do? What's a priest do in any denomination?
The sacraments.
The sacraments.
Conduct communion.
Communion, baptism, as well as burials and marriages, and counseling. What else does it do? Preach. The regular preacher for the church. This church, its earliest controversy. Remember, originally we were the Skaneateles Religious Society, and we were the local courts, and we heard people's complaints. Because Bruce has a cow at his farm that gets out and goes over to Doris's house and eats the flowers, and the cow gets sick and the cow dies, and Bruce is angry because he just lost his income, and Doris is angry because she just lost her flowers. Ignore the snow. And you're both angry because you now have this dead carcass to deal with. And the issue was, as you came to the church, how do you forgive each other? How do you agree to work together, regardless of what happened? The controversy that came for us as a church was after 5 years. Shall we continue to be the religious society who are the local courts and the local schools and preparing people for communion? Or should we be a church? Because a church has a minister, and a church has a building, and a church sends monies to missions away rather than doing things locally for their own community. And that issue was decided 8-7 by one vote that we would become a church instead of staying as a religious society. In hindsight, there's a part of me that really wishes we'd gone the other way, because what it says is the members of the church take responsibility for the church. And it's not about the cost of the building. It's not about pensions. It is truly about our ministry and our care for it. But in that time, we became a Presbyterian church. So we are priests. We're also pastors. What's a pastor do that's different from a priest? Pastors also call on people. Pastors have pastoral responsibility. So we do baptisms. We do funerals. Remember back when we were talking about baptism last week, we'd said originally the only ones who could do First Communion were the bishops because they were the pastors. And those who could do the baptisms were the local priests. So the bishops had more responsibility, and the bishops were a pastoral function. As a Presbyterian minister, I'm both the priest who does the local functions, as well as the pastor who has pastoral concern for the whole congregation, but I'm also a presbyter. Presbyter means that we go elected from the local congregation to the presbytery to answer decisions that are there for the larger church. This church is also a presbyter. So the church sends 2 elders, and the ministers, also by virtue of being ministers in the presbytery, get to go. And our votes are equal, and our votes could cancel each other out. So it could happen that Mario and I disagree, and we would cancel each other out, or it could be that Jill Newton and Cindy Hinman go as elders of the session, and they decide one thing, and Mario and I decide something else, and we cancel each other out. Or we could vote together, and because we are the largest church, and every other church is sending 1 or 2 representatives, and we're sending 4, we could actually equal at least 2 churches, if not 4 churches, in our decision making. Okay. What that also means is that Mario and I represent the presbytery here. So there are times in which it may be a decision we don't agree with, but the denomination has taken this stand, and we need to represent that. And we need to defend the denomination to the local church, because we are a Presbyterian church. One of the issues that is coming today is that the culture has shifted. Prior to 5 years ago, if a church decided that it didn't want to be Presbyterian anymore, the church could leave. But the building and all of its assets belong to the Presbyterian church. Nowadays, the courts have gone the other way. The courts have said the congregation owns the building and the congregation owns its property, and when the church ceases to exist, then the property belongs to the presbytery. But if a church chooses to leave the denomination, they can often take their building and take their property, and there's usually a settlement agreement between the two. It gets very messy, but it is happening today. the churches are actually leaving denominations with the property, which used to be unheard of. It was the one carrot that was always held out. The congregation also has a role in the matching that happens. So that once you graduate from college and you graduate from seminary, you then have ordination exams that have to be taken. Sandy, when you became a nurse, you had to pass the nursing exams.
Yes.
And Mario, I know with the bar exam, you had to pass the bar exams. As ministers, there are four-hour written exams. One on Bible content, one on exegesis, where you take from the original language of Hebrew and of Greek, and you have to translate the Bible passage. You're not given the passage ahead of time. And you go to the library, you are given Deuteronomy 26, verse 5 and 6, and you translate it from Hebrew into English, and you do research on it, and you write up the background, what's called exegesis. You research that topic, and you write a sermon on it, all within 4 hours. And then you do the same thing in Greek for the New Testament. There's also a 4-hour exam on theology and a 4-hour exam on the sacraments and church history. So it's a very thorough treating to make sure that you are prepared for whatever's going to come. Because at that point, you are ordained. And the denomination is not saying you are ordained for only churches of 20 members, or you're ordained only for working in funerals. They're saying you're ordained for anything. So you have to be able to answer any question, whether it is for dealing with children, or dealing with senior citizens, or a large church or a small church. Do you understand what the issues are? At which point, you're able to circulate your resume, except the resume for ministers is about 26 pages, and the church also has a resume, and as Doug Rattan described, this is like computer dating. It all gets fed into the computer, and there's computer matching between churches and ministers, on the basis of which the church receives all the candidates who match up at least 3/4 of the categories. At which point, the church decides they're going to interview these people, they're going to listen to sermons. We now have sermons on websites that committees can listen to. It used to be that the committees had to come to the church to listen to the pastor. And I know when my father was a minister, there would often be committees that came to the church because that was the only way in which they could hear ministers. There was a time when I was coming here in which it was cassette tapes, and then it was video cassettes before the current technology. And nowadays I never know who is looking at me and who isn't, because it's all online all the time. At which point, when they decide that they're ready for you, they have you come and have a neutral weekend at the church, and the committee decides, out of all the candidates that we've looked at, is this the one we want to have? And they present them to the congregation, and they lead the worship service, and the congregation votes that yes, this is the minister we want to have, and call it to be our pastor for as long as it's good and healthy. And that could be, the national average is now 3 to 5 years, which is to say for ministers like myself who have been in the call for 18 years, there's an equal number who have been serving for less than 3 years to balance that out, so that it becomes 3 to 5. We're turning over very rapidly. Personally, I have a problem with that, because it takes 5 to 10 years to really develop the trust with the congregation before people feel that they can share their issues with you, before you know the congregation, and before the congregation knows you. And if you're living in 3 years, the church is never really dealing with its issues. For ordination, we started in the 1920s with women as to whether, because of equal rights, whether women could be ordained as deacons, and then as elders, and then as ministers in the 1950s. Then the issue of divorce, then the issue of race. More recently, the issue of sexuality has come up, and it came back to the issue of membership. And that was decided 3 years ago for ordination, and more recently, it's come up in the issue of marriage, because there are several states, New York State being one of them, that now allows for marriage between persons of the same sex. Marriage. What are the issues? What's marriage about?
Inheritance.
Bottom line, it started out because of inheritance. You wanted to make sure, like, what's Abraham and Sarah all about? The land and a child. Why? Because the child's going to inherit the land. You have to have a child to give the land to. You have to have land to give to the child. It's as basic as that. And a name, because a name is an identity. And when, in ancient times, far more sexist times than we live in today, women were treated as property. And a man gave his identity to his wife and to his children. And it's because of that that in testimony in court, a woman cannot be forced to testify against her husband. And now, because of professionalism, a man can't be forced to testify against his wife. Children can be compelled to testify if they choose to. But it goes back to that idea of being part of the same one identity. You own property together, you own real estate together, you have a name together, you are Mr. and Mrs. together, and it all comes back to that original identity, which comes from the church of saying you were two and now you are one. You are joined together as one together. A big piece of it was about paternity, because particularly in the royalty, when you were inheriting land, you had to make sure that this was a legitimate child. And where fathers had often fathered children with other women, those were not legitimate heirs, where only the married one was legitimate. And in different cultures, there have been more than one spouse. Christianity, in its early days, decided that monogamy was to be encouraged. This was one of the morals that we adopted. And so we have stood by one man, one woman, up until the current time where it's now two people in the language. The parts of the service come back to those original issues. Originally, Peter would have come to the church and been seated with all the single men on one side of the church. And the woman that he married would have been seated on the opposite side of the church with all the single women. And all the married people and those with children would have been seated in between. And you would have wanted permission to date. And dating was monogamous, and dating was chaperoned. And you came to the church, to the minister in session, and asked permission, at which point we negotiated dowries, and we asked about your intentions. This is where the family negotiations as to whether it was good for the church and good for the community and good for the families was all decided. At which point, we would find a 75-year-old woman who had never been married, who would be assigned as the chaperone. What she knew about marriage, we have no idea. But she would guide you through your courtship to say, now's when you need to make her dinner. Now's when you need to bring him flowers. Men don't mean that. Men have a different shorthand than women do. This is what he meant when he said that. There's a book that came out several years ago, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, that says we speak a different shorthand. We operate differently. And she would guide you through that courtship. And when she determined you were ready, not that you could get the country club or the band or whatever was going to be the reception, but when she decided you were ready, she would post a note on the doors of the church that were considered the bulletin board of the community, that the whole church should come to hear the wedding vows of this couple. And it was only the wedding vows. And it was their making this sacrament, this change of identity, from being single persons into being a married couple, that were blessed as one. But we still didn't have the ring. When in America did men start wearing wedding bands? 1914. How come?
Because they went off to World War I.
And the women wanted to make sure that there was some identification on him when he went away, so that other women would know that they were married. Women wore wedding bands as long back as we can find. Actually, Cleopatra had wedding bands. Some actually wore it through their nose, which is part of the Ruth story. But men didn't wear them because of factory work and because of farming. It was dangerous to have rings on. And when they were going overseas, they wanted to have a remembrance of home. And so wore the wedding band. And so the third celebration was actually the giving of the bands when you could afford to buy gold. And at that point, if you had children, the baptism of the children. So these were three totally separate celebrations. One between the families and the church, one for the whole community, and one just for the couple. And at that point, for the baptism of their children. In much the same way in which we have the church, the Presbytery, and God deciding about ordination. They're always, in the Presbyterian church, we come back to the three. We love the Trinity, and we want to come back to that image. The identity of a commitment of the couple and the romance of marriage is really a very recent development in human civilization. This really comes back late 19th century, early 20th century. And before that time, it was far more about the family decided this was good for you. The family had found a spouse for you. I've shared with Doris a couple times that my mother died in my birth, and the church felt a responsibility that they needed to get a new wife for the pastor. And because there was a woman in the congregation who had been left at the altar, she was the prime candidate, and she happened to be the organist. And they spent 50 years together. They truly fell in love and had a wonderful relationship. He did with his first wife also. But it was the church felt that responsibility. Nowadays, there are all kinds of personnel requirements that would not be possible. Ministers have power. If, as the pastor, I tell you what you have to do, it carries some importance with it. Whether people follow that or not is a question of our culture today. But there was a time in which what the pastor said was great authority, and ultimate authority we'll get into next week. What's the ultimate authority a minister had over you? What about God? What
Do they have children?
No, even more ultimate than that. What's going to happen to all of us eventually?
Oh, they died.
You die. Where can you be buried?
Oh,
Will you be buried on holy soil in a church cemetery or not? And the ministers decided, which was part of excommunication and shunning, was whether you were on holy soil, whether you went to heaven or not. And it was, nowadays there are community cemeteries, and people often have the funeral director do the service, so it's not considered as being the same rights that it used to be. But it was a major issue for families. I want to offer one last thing, because he's my favorite theologian. He is very little known, named Leslie Newbigin. And Leslie was actually Church of Scotland, who eventually, Church of Scotland is where the Presbyterians come from, but because he went to Oxford, he eventually became an Episcopal minister, and then served a Baptist church in Australia and a church in South Africa, for which he was eventually made a bishop. And he came up with this paradigm, and I think it's a very important one for understanding how we interpret the sacraments and the teachings of the Bible. There's God, there's the church, and there's culture. And these three are always in relationship with each other. So that as the culture changes, it changes the ways in which we preach, it changes some of the things the church does. Some of the things. Because we're also in relationship to God. And this is sacred. So we're not the church of what's happening now. We're not going with whatever the latest tradition is. We are trying to remain faithful to the scriptures and the confessions and to what is sacred. But also, God is continually offering new challenges and new opportunities for the church and for the community. And because the culture is changing because of God. And also, the church has an impact on the culture and on the ways in which they know about God. The ways in which we preach, the ways in which worship is done, the music that is played and sung, as well as who we are as the church, all continues to be in transition because of those three. We've also had, in the past, we always had a different symbol that does the same thing. What's our relationship with God? What's our relationship with the culture? And so you had the symbol of the cross. All he's done is to make it a triangle instead of a cross. But our faith is not just between you and me, or me and God. It's between the church and the world around us as well. One of the things I've been fascinated about this year, and, humility gratified. Ministers always think that we're preaching on Sunday morning and people forget it during the week. And I found out this year there have been a lot of conversations from people about what was said in church and what's happened in the sermons or in the worship service. And it's come back months afterwards of people saying, we listened to that. And it's caused questions, it's caused dialogue. That's exciting. I don't think there's anything more gratifying to a minister than the people actually took it seriously and listened and questioned. So that a lot of what we're dealing with today are questions rather than answers. There was a time in which the church provided answers and felt as though we had firm answers on it. And today, the church is encountering cultural situations that are a different circumstance than we've had before, so it's raising a lot of questions for people. We're still often sought as a source for answers. In counseling, I always have to be very careful that I not give people answers, because they may come back and ask me again, or I may have been wrong. And you never know which it's going to be. But it's always a place of helping the person come to their own decision, which they're going to own more than if I try and tell them what it's going to be. Questions, comments about marriage or ordination? I've been talking a long time.
The question that you brought up earlier about I'm trying to think quite how to phrase it. How would a church decide to split, given that you had previously said once you're
Part of that denomination,
you're always there. So how could they possibly split?
And
you say?
this has been, any decision in the church always has at least 3 different hands going at the same time. One of which is in the local church. Is there division in the church, or does the whole church feel as though the denomination's wrong and they want to leave? And it may be that half the church want to leave and half the church want to stay. It may be that the pastor wants to leave and the church wants to stay. So we've got to figure that relationship out. Second is over the issues that are causing it. The third piece is how does the process actually work? And one of the things that's been going on at the General Assembly in this last year has been, because of the homosexuality issue, because of cultural change, a lot of churches that have been leaving the denomination. And so they've set up a process for how this takes place. Because it was not only the church property and the membership, which is your baptized rolls, and the assets of the church, it was also our ordination.
That's what I was bringing up, was this.
So ministers had to have a different denomination created that they would leave the Presbyterian church to go to. And where I grew up, this gets into all kinds of other stuff. In the 1920s, we had an issue called the Old School, New School. And the issue was really over 3 different issues. The first 5 books of the Bible are what? And they're called the Pentateuch. They're also called the Law. Pentateuch means 5 books in Greek. Torah means the books of the law. These were the books of Moses. Who wrote them? Prior to the 1800s, it was understood that Moses wrote the books of Moses. That's why they're called the books of Moses. Except in the book of Deuteronomy, there are speeches that were given at Moses' funeral. How could that have been done? How did Moses know what was going to be said? And he may have written, he may be the ghostwriter for them. But also, there were different names for God. There's Yahweh, there's Elohim, there's El Shaddai, Adonai, Eloheinu. All of these are legitimate names for the God that we know. How come? And then began a field of archaeology. And with archaeology, they came to claim that there were at least 3 different authors for the Old Testament. And the old school model was that Moses wrote those 5 books. The new school was there were a variety of different authors, and there was a 4th group that were the editors that wove it in together. So there were the priests who wrote poetic pieces for worship, liturgy. There were those who believed in a God called Elohim. There were those who believed in a God called Yahweh. And there's a book of Deuteronomy, which edited everything on the basis of the motto, if you do right, what's God going to do?
Bless you.
If you do wrong,
Punish.
punish you. And so that motto was put through the editing of the 5 books. That's a new school interpretation. Second issue was over the authority of the church. When we have missionaries who grew up in the church, Judy has been a part of the life of the church since her baptism as an infant. She's grown up in the church. We all know her. She decides that she wants to go be a missionary. We say, good, go. And she goes and she writes home to us saying, there are terrible blisters on people here. They need bandages. And we as a congregation tear bandages and send them to her. This congregation had a long history of taking the TC timber toys and remaking them and sending them to the mission field, particularly to missionaries that we knew. There were also churches that said, instead of having a local person who goes, wouldn't it be better if we sent them to seminary and made sure that they were fully prepared for this and that they were prepared for the rigors of being in an international place where it may not be the same culture that we're accustomed to here, and where they would be sent to the appropriate place. It may be that Teresa and Judy both decide they want to be missionaries and they both go to the same village in the Cameroons. That's not an efficient use of the skills that are there. So maybe we need a board to determine who goes where. Third issue is over slavery. Not only did members of churches own slaves, but also ministers owned slaves and churches owned slaves. In the North, we were working for abolition. So how can the church on a social issue be both working for abolition and holding slaves? And that became the issue that split the old school, new school. And there are still churches today, 2 Presbyterian churches in a town, where one is an old school church and one is a new school church, that divided in the 1800s to the 1920s, and they've never gotten back together.
I'm sorry, this is in Syracuse?
Across the country.
All
Across the country.
I thought you said in town.
No, across the country, in various different towns.
I see.
In the 1950s, we merged together the Presbyterian Church in North America and the PCUSA, which was the Presbyterian Church in the United States. It was still the Southern Presbyterian Church. And that's the point at which we got all of the 3-year terms figured out for administration. But still, the Northern Church and Southern Church were 2 separate ones. In 1983, we merged together the Northern Church and Southern Church. We said we've tried to get these 2 together for 37 years, and we haven't been able to do it. So you just get to be together, and you'll work out your problems over time. Sort of like a marriage, an arranged marriage that you put together, and you'll figure out the differences. And there were several churches that said, no, we're going to leave. And from that, you then had PCUSA, which was our new denomination, and the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and the newer one that's called the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. Orthodox means the one true church, but in this case it's not the original church. It's a more recent adaptation. And Orthodox usually refers to, they don't ordain women as ministers, elders, or deacons. Okay? And it comes back, bottom line, and this is a sad reason why churches have remained separate in denomination. It's also why there are problems in churches today, is because of ministers' pensions. When Judy and I first started having children, our children were 100% covered by our insurance. Their delivery was 100% paid for, and our insurance was 100% coverage. Then it became that there was a deductible that had to be met before the insurance kicked in. Then there was a copay that had to be paid. Then there was also a deductible that had to be paid, just as all of our insurance is. The pension now does not cover, automatically doesn't cover spouses, and our church decided that it should. Up until 10 years ago, ministers were never fully vested, so I could not leave the denomination with my pension. 10 years ago, the courts decided that's not appropriate. If you've been ordained for at least 20 years, you ought to be fully vested. And so now, even if a minister is found guilty of some crime, they can still keep the pension, or if they leave the denomination. So what's happening is ministers are leaving denominations and taking their Presbyterian pension with them to a different denomination.
When you say courts, you're referring not to church court, but to
Actually, to legal courts,
legal
to the courts of law.
Yes.
And that's probably another piece we need to come back to next week, is that there are church courts as well as disciplinary courts of law, and they have a different basis in their legal system, but we try to work out the problems in the church courts before it ever gets to the Presbytery or eventually to the courts of law. But these are the issues the church is having to deal with today. Is so when you see Presbyterian, it may not be the same Presbyterian church you're accustomed to. Even if it was a Presbyterian church that you knew growing up, it may now be part of a different Presbyterian church.
I went to a Presbyterian church in Florida just because it was closer to where we were. And women had no rights there. I couldn't believe that. I never went back. I went back to my old church on the sea, by the sea. I couldn't believe that the Presbyterian church believed in that.
As
Is
well.
that PCA?
See, I don't know.
I think it was PCA.
Okay.
Presbyterian Church in America is another
Yeah,
denomination.
Okay.
Does not ordain women.
Oh, okay.
And the EPC is over the sexuality issue. These are the issues in our culture today, and it's that tension going back and forth about, do we listen to God or do we listen to the church? Do we listen to the historic interpretations of Scripture or to the world around us? And they're uneasy times. And how do we minister to people everywhere?
Are we a red church versus a blue church?
Are we the reds and the whites? Yeah. Yeah. So,
Do all of our rules and regs come down through Synod in Presbytery?
actually, we have, originally the Presbyterian Church started where?
Scott?
Well, originally it started in Scotland. But when it came to America,
Someplace in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, the first Presbyterian.
Did you fry her? She's got all
No,
the...
I can spell Philadelphia, it's a question. Okay, she's a minister's kid, Presbyterian minister's kid. Philadelphia, and started in the 1600s. We started long before we were actually a country. And we were part of the Mayflower coming over. And we established the Book of Order, called the Boo, and we established having a General Assembly. And the General Assembly was an equal gathering of the elders and ministers from all the presbyteries. So you had General Assemblies and you had presbyteries and congregations. And then over time, we came to realize that the presbyteries were spreading out across the country, and there were too many of them, so we established synods. So we currently are part of the Synod of the Northeast, which is the 17 states in the Northeast. And there's also Presbytery, there's also a synod that goes down the East Coast. There's a Presbytery of Mid-America, there's a Presbytery of Alaska and Hawaii, and so forth. Synods, synods. Presbyteries tend to be the local geographic area. For us, it's currently 38 churches. The General Assembly makes constitutional law. The Synod then interprets those for its regional body and provides money to it. The Presbytery sets up local ways when it comes down to maternity leave and how long in that area a woman is going to be gone from the church as a minister. If paternity leave, when Mel has her baby, how long should Mario be able to have off? What is culturally appropriate to that area? Because what's culturally appropriate in Florida or in Nebraska may be different than in the Northeast. Also true for salaries. Those tend to be decided by presbyteries. We also, as a local church, have our own rules that we adopt, which are our bylaws. We can't set up any rules that violate the ones higher, but we can always create a local interpretation for them. So things like, in our congregation, we elect alternates who will serve if ever there's a vacancy on session or deacons mid-year. And that's not in the Book of Order. That's not from the Presbytery. It's not from the Synod. It comes down from our local bylaws that we established. Did that answer what you were looking for?
How long ago was that?
That actually was here before I came. I believe it came during early spring, along with deacon serving communion. Was when Earl was a commissioner to the General Assembly when the issue was being raised about how young can you be to receive communion. I remember that one very painfully because I went through confirmation so that I could receive communion, and just as we're about to receive communion for the first time, was told now everybody can have it.
Are any of those paid positions?
There are administrative offices in all of those.
And they set the law for everybody?
Okay, there are administrative offices in all those. There are also annual gatherings. Our presbytery now meets twice a year. It has one person who is part-time, who serves as the stated clerk and web communicator. He's the one who posts everything to the web. We don't have an executive presbytery, we don't have offices or secretaries anymore. We're dealing with a virtual office. The Synod is actually located in DeWitt for those 17 states, all the presbyteries. It has a Synod executive and 2 administrative assistants. The General Assembly is currently in Louisville, in Kentucky, and it has many offices there. But every other year, there's a national gathering of the General Assembly. Twice a year there's a gathering of the Synod, twice a year there's a gathering of the Presbytery. That is the ministers and the elders. We're not paid to go. We go because that is our church, and it's representing our local church in these decisions. That's what our per capita goes to. We pay per capita portion.
So when practices change or evolve within our,
Yep.
um,
How does it happen?
yeah, and who brings it forth and who decides, and is there a body of people who vote on it?
So we considered last year, our session had, because of the discussion about Israel, we had an elder on session who felt passionately about this and wanted to bring to the presbytery an overture. From the local church, we would send an overture, just as happens in government. When you send an overture, it becomes a bill, it becomes a law. We send it to the presbytery. The presbytery debates it, discusses it, and votes on it, and then it gets sent up to the General Assembly.
But
And
our
the gen-
presbytery only has one person right now.
only has one staff person, but it has all the ministers from all the local Presbyterian churches and elders from each church. Difference in the Episcopalians and Presbyterians. What's the difference governmentally between us? Very similar model. They have elders, we have elders. We have ministers, they have elders. Ministers. They have a bishop. How come?
Goes back from Catholicism.
It goes back to Catholicism. Also, the Presbyterians don't trust individuals. We trust committees. It's actually very true. But also, in the episcopacy, when the elders make a decision, it's an advisory decision. The only ones who actually get to vote and it becomes rule are the ministers. In the Presbyterian church, the ministers and elders sit together, and in the debates, you can't tell who's a minister and who's an elder. And in the voting, it's one vote, and majority rules. Doesn't matter whether they were the ministers or the elders who voted. Okay? So the overture goes up to the General Assembly. It gets sent to committee. The committee reworks it over a period of the week that they're gathered together, meeting together for 8-10 hours a day to talk about that issue in these committees. Out of which they come back to the General Assembly plenary session, where all the ministers and elders from all the presbyteries are gathered, and they debate it all over again, at which point they choose which side wins, which side loses. Then it has to come back for a majority of the presbyteries to adopt it as well. The issue about homosexuality and marriage just yesterday was adopted in the Presbyterian Church. It happened last year in June, but it was not ratified by more than 50% of the church presbyteries until yesterday. Actually, our presbytery has not voted yet, but there's more than half who have voted in favor of it. So, okay. Other
Like
questions?
sending a letter to your congressman or whatever, can you do that?
Yeah.
To the church?
And we did. When the issue came up about Israel, we contacted those who were going to be our representatives before the assembly met to say you need to be informed about this issue, and they weren't. And so I went and visited them and explained the issues from our elder and gave our session members and printed in the bulletin that here's the people you could contact. And they did. And they went to the assembly, and then when they came back, they made a point of calling me to explain how they voted and also how the assembly had voted, so I could explain it to the session. And actually, both of our minister and elder representatives were only able to send one of each, because how small our presbytery is. Both voted against the Israel issue, but it still passed. And so they were letting us know that they voted the direction we wanted them to. Our session taken action on this, but we lost. And that is our democratic process.
Yeah.
Do decisions ever get reversed?
Yep. Because you're talking about two different kinds of decisions. One is law, and and one is social decision. When it's law, it's binding. And it's possible, was prohibition ever reversed? Yes. Was it a mess? Absolutely. Is anyone ever going to propose law that takes the rights away from women? No, it was too hard fought. We're not going to reverse those decisions.
But is that a legal matter or is that a church matter?
I'm in church law,
Okay.
okay? Because we also dealt with women's rights in the church.
Yes.
But it follows the exact same process, because many of our original signers of the Constitution were Presbyterian, which is why we have the same system.
Well, what is the definition of law versus the other?
Social policy. Social policy is not binding. So 2 years ago, the General Assembly voted on the issue about Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, and Caterpillar with Israel, and voted against it. And this year it came up and it passed by 8 votes. And 2 years from now, it could come up again and be voted against. It is not binding on social issues. It may be that the Presbyterian Church at some point in time says, we don't want to be in favor of nuclear weapons. We have at different times said that. And at other times come back saying, but we believe this war was just. How can a church be on both sides? Because it's a different gathering of people. And over time, we will. One of the differences between the Presbyterian Church and the Catholic Church, in the Catholic Church, there's papal infallibility. The Pope cannot say, I was wrong, or my predecessor was wrong. They can create new interpretations and new applications, but they can't say the earlier one was wrong. In the Presbyterian Church, I often am told I'm wrong. Often the Presbyterian Church says, we decided this way at one point in time, the culture shifted, we're now going this direction.
Well, I'm sorry, but that isn't the question I guess I asked was, you said you can't change law. What defines law versus social change?
If it's in the Book of Order as a rule, it's law. If it is not in the book, to change the Book of Order is a very complicated process with the bills going up. Social policy could be any member at the General Assembly, one of those plenary voters, could come up with an idea and say, I want to put this forward.
I just want to know what establish the difference.
And really it comes down to constitutional law versus social witness policy. Doris?
Why is Scripture and God not the ultimate authority?
They are. Absolutely they are. But the question becomes, I've known many different ministers who interpreted the Bible differently, who look at the exact same passage and come back saying, black and white. And how can you do that? But they do. They read the Bible differently, with different eyes. There are some of us who read the Bible literally, and some of us who read the Bible by interpretation. It comes back to the old school, new school. If God gave it to Moses, that's inerrant. If it was written by a number of different authors, there may be textual discrepancies there that we can change the words to make it fit.
But it seems that there are several things that are just not subject to interpretation.
And that's this issue of the culture saying it's now subject to interpretation, where before it was not. And part of the difficulty is the church is captive to our culture. There was a time in which the church said, divorce is inappropriate. Jesus said to marry more than one person is wrong. But Moses knew that you were too hard-hearted for that. So he wrote you a script for divorce. Moses did. But when asked, is divorce wrong? Jesus said yes. They're not easy issues. And they weigh heavy on us. And they cause great division in the church and within denominations. And all of this comes back to, they're such important decisions because they are what we describe as sacred. This is our connection with God. Thank you for your attention tonight. We went quite a bit longer, but I think this was important stuff. Thank you.